Hello and welcome to the unseen question. You grow up being told the chains are golden, that they keep you safe, that without them, you drift into chaos. You learn to love the weight around your wrists, to believe it's there because someone loves you, not to punish you, but to protect you. And for a long time, that story makes sense, until you start noticing that the key was always in your pocket. Leaving religion is often compared to waking up, but that metaphor is too clean. It makes it sound like all you needed was a little nudge, a moment of clarity. In reality, for many people, leaving religion feels more like breaking out of a tight, enclosed room that was disguised as a home, and then realizing the door was never locked to begin with. That's the thing about cults and religion in many of its forms. They don't need to force you to stay. They just make you believe there's nowhere else to go. From the outside, it's easy to underestimate how powerful that illusion can be. When you're born into a belief system, when it shapes your family, your friendships, your moral compass, your identity, it's not just a set of ideas you disagree with later on. It's the air you breathe before you even knew what thinking was. That's why when people talk about leaving religion, they don't usually describe it like dropping a bad habit. They describe it like escape, like peeling back layers of programming that shaped their entire worldview. And that's not a coincidence. Psychologists and sociologists who study high-control groups, including cults, have long identified the same red flags: absolute authority, us versus them thinking, isolation from opposing views, strict rules about behavior, fear-based control, emotional manipulation, and a deep sense that questioning the group equals betraying it. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because many organized religions, especially the more dogmatic ones, operate using these same patterns. Not all of them, but enough that the comparisons aren't just poetic, they're structural. Let's look at one of the most common control mechanisms: the idea that your thoughts are never fully your own. That questioning isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. It's not just a sin, it's a threat. And not just to you, but to everyone around you. In this system, doubt isn't something to explore. It's something to suppress. And if you voice it, you're punished. Not always physically, but emotionally, socially, psychologically. You're shamed, excluded, labeled, pitted. You're told that you're being deceived, that you're falling away, that you're letting the devil in. It creates a closed loop, a self-policing system where belief isn't just a choice, it's a requirement, a condition for love, community, acceptance. And that's what makes it so hard to leave, because leaving doesn't just mean walking away from ideas. It often means losing your family, your friends, your safety net. It means rebuilding your identity from scratch. And when that's the cost, a lot of people stay, not because they still believe, but because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. That's not freedom. That's not choice. That's coercion. It may not have bars or guards, but it traps you all the same. One of the hallmarks of cult behavior is something called thought stopping. It's when you're trained to interrupt your own questions with pre-programmed answers. So if you start wondering, why does an all-powerful God need constant worship? You immediately hear, his ways are higher than ours. If you ask, why does a loving God send people to eternal torment? You're reminded that we all deserve punishment and he's just. This isn't just unhelpful. It's designed to short-circuit critical thinking. It creates an emotional reflex: discomfort, guilt, fear. The very act of questioning feels wrong. That's what cult specialists call loaded language, phrases that shut down inquiry instead of encouraging it. And once that reflex is in place, people stop examining what they believe. Not because the answers make sense, but because the questions feel forbidden. This is how smart, capable, kind people stay locked into systems that don't serve them. Because those systems taught them that freedom was dangerous, that doubt was betrayal, and that anything outside the walls was darkness. But what happens when you do step outside? The first thing you notice is the silence. There's no thunderbolt, no punishment, no lightning from the sky, just quiet. And in that quiet, you start hearing your own voice again, maybe for the first time in years. You realize that morality didn't vanish without religion. You didn't turn evil. You didn't lose your purpose. In fact, things become clearer not because you replaced old beliefs with new ones, but because you finally let yourself start asking real questions. What do I believe? Why do I believe it? What kind of life do I want to live if no one else is scripting it for me? Those questions can be terrifying, But they're also liberating. Because now, the answers are yours to discover, not handed down, not memorized, not enforced. Yours. This is why so many ex-believers describe leaving religion as an act of reclaiming their mind, reclaiming their time, their identity, their ability to say, I don't know, and I want to find out. People often assume that when someone leaves religion, they must be angry, or that something bad happened to push them away. But more often, what actually pushes people out is thinking, reading, observing contradictions, asking honest questions and getting dishonest answers. What makes it feel like a betrayal isn't that the answers were wrong. It's that you were told never to ask. That's what breaks the spell. Because belief, when it's authentic, doesn't need to be protected from questions. But indoctrination does. If a worldview can't tolerate scrutiny, then maybe it isn't a worldview. Maybe it's a script. A set of lines you were taught to recite, with no real understanding behind them. And if that's the case, walking away isn't rebellion. It's intellectual honesty. But let's be clear, this isn't just about doctrine. It's about control. When a group, religious or not, makes obedience more important than truth, loyalty more important than integrity, and conformity more important than understanding, that's cult behavior. And when those things are wrapped in language of love, holiness, or salvation, it becomes even harder to recognize. You're told you're part of the chosen, that outsiders are lost, that you're special, but only as long as you stay inside the lines. That's not community. That's conditional belonging. And it's exactly how control systems keep people compliant. Not through fear alone, but through the fear of losing something you were never allowed to question in the first place. Some of the most powerful religions have done this for centuries. Reinforcing hierarchies, silencing dissent, preserving outdated moral codes not because they make sense, but because challenging them would threaten the authority of the system. Take purity culture, for example. In many religious traditions, especially conservative ones, control over sexuality isn't just encouraged, it's central. You're taught that your body isn't your own, that your desires are shameful, that sex is dirty unless sanctioned by a religious script. And why? Because controlling something as personal and universal as desire is one of the fastest ways to control a person's entire life. It's not about virtue. It's about obedience. This isn't just theory. Sociological studies have shown that high-control religious groups often enforce strict rules around gender roles, sexuality, family life, and education. The more rigid the belief system, the more tightly these areas are policed. And what happens when someone breaks the rules? They're not just corrected, they're shamed, excluded, sometimes even disowned. This is another hallmark of cult-like religion, the weaponization of guilt. The idea that your pain is your fault, that suffering is a test, that doubt is sin, that any negative emotion means you're failing to be faithful. It's a trap that keeps people stuck in cycles of self-blame, always trying harder to be good enough in a system where the goalposts are constantly moving. And that's exactly how control survives, by keeping you focused inward, never outward, by convincing you that the problem is you, not the system. But step outside that system, and the fog starts to lift. You start to notice how much of your inner world was shaped not by personal discovery, but by pressure, by repetition, by authority figures who claim to speak for the divine and taught you not to question them. You realize how many of your deepest fears were learned. Not inherent, not natural. Learned fear of hell, fear of punishment, fear of being alone, fear of being wrong. These aren't spiritual insights. They're psychological weapons. And when you start to let them go, you don't lose your morality, you reclaim it. Because real morality doesn't come from threats. It comes from empathy, from understanding, from facing real-world consequences, not supernatural ones. In fact, many people who leave religion report becoming more thoughtful, not less, more grounded in compassion, more open to nuance. When you're no longer trying to fit everything into a binary of saved or lost, good or evil, right or damned, you start to see people for who they really are. That's not a loss. That's growth. But still, for many people, leaving religion feels like losing a part of themselves. And that's not because they missed the belief, it's because belief was entangled with everything else. Family, routine, holidays, music, identity. It's a grief process. And it's real. In that sense, leaving religion can mirror what cult survivors go through. Not because every religion is a cult, but because the psychological architecture overlaps. A closed system, a charismatic authority, a black and white view of the world, fear of outsiders, isolation, emotional dependence, and a deep, learned belief that leaving means something terrible will happen to you. And just like in cult recovery, the healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. As you relearn how to think freely, how to trust yourself, how to make meaning without being told what it should be. But the most surprising part, most people don't become jaded. They don't become bitter. They become curious, open, calm. Because when you let go of a belief system that told you what to think and start building one that reflects how you actually see the world, something strange happens. You become more comfortable with uncertainty. You stop needing all the answers. You stop pretending to know what can't be known. And in that space, where fear used to live, peace moves in. One of the quietest revelations after leaving religion is realizing how much of your mental bandwidth was spent trying to make things make sense that never actually did. Trying to reconcile an all-loving God with eternal torment. Trying to square religious teachings with scientific facts. Trying to justify stories that contradict both logic and each other. You spend years bending your mind into shapes it was never meant to hold. Not because the answers were there, but because you were told they had to be. It's exhausting. And you don't notice that exhaustion until it's gone. Then one day you hear someone say, "I don't know," and you realize that those 3 words, the ones you were trained to avoid, might be the most honest words in the world. Because not knowing is not a weakness. It's the beginning of inquiry. It's the spark behind every discovery we've ever made. Cults discourage that kind of thinking. So do many religions. Because when people start asking real questions, they usually find real inconsistencies. And the more tightly a system is built on untestable claims, the more it relies on trust and fear and social reinforcement. When you're inside it, you're not just believing. You're being believed for. Your doubts are pre-answered. Your questions are framed as tests. And any contradiction is either ignored or blamed on your lack of faith. But once you step out, once you stop playing defense for a belief system you didn't choose, you start to see how many of those defenses were circular. Why is the Bible true? Because it says it is. Why trust the church? Because God appointed it. Why believe in God? Because the Bible says so. That kind of logic doesn't hold up anywhere else. You wouldn't trust a courtroom or a doctor or a business to prove itself using only its own authority. But when it comes to religion, we're trained to lower the bar. We're told it's noble to believe without evidence. That faith without reason is a virtue. That the less you ask, the stronger you are. But that's not strength. That's surrender. True strength is being willing to ask the hard questions. Not just of religion, but of yourself. And being okay with whatever the answer is, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it changes everything. That's not easy, but it's honest. And once you experience that kind of honesty, it's hard to go back to pretending. Pretending to believe. Pretending to feel what you don't. Pretending that ancient texts written in tribal societies still somehow apply seamlessly to the complexity of modern life. Because they don't. And deep down, most people know it. They just don't say it out loud. In fact, data backs this up. In many countries, religious affiliation is dropping, especially among younger generations. But what's even more interesting is that even among people who still identify as religious, many quietly admit they don't believe the core doctrines. They're there for the culture, the tradition, the community, and that's telling. It means the structure remains, but the belief is fading. The shell stays up, but the core is gone, because belief is hard to fake forever. Especially in a world where information is everywhere, and where questioning isn't as taboo as it once was. That's part of why so many institutions are doubling down, getting louder, stricter, more insular. It's a defense mechanism, a way of holding back the tide. But tides don't care about walls. They move on their own time. Still, for someone inside a faith structure, leaving can feel like stepping into the tide without a boat, like giving up certainty in exchange for chaos. But what you eventually find is that the chaos isn't as scary as it seemed. In fact, it's not chaos at all. It's complexity. It's nuance. It's the kind of worldview that says we don't need a single source of truth to be moral. or a divine plan to find meaning, or an invisible judge to be kind, you start to realize that your values were never religious. They were human. And that the best parts of your former belief system, compassion, forgiveness, justice, don't depend on a deity to exist. You can want those things because you're alive and conscious and aware that other people are too. You don't need a holy book to tell you that suffering is bad, or that joy is good, or that kindness matters. These things aren't revelations. They're observations. They come from experience, not commandment. And when you live without religion, you don't live without meaning. You create meaning. You choose it. You shape it based on what actually works, not what was handed to you under threat of eternal punishment. That's what separates a belief from a belief system. One is open to change. The other demands obedience. And over time, you see the difference more clearly. One teaches you how to think. The other tells you what to think. One invites questions. The other discourages them. One says your worth is intrinsic. The other says you were born broken and need to be saved. When you stack them side by side, the choice becomes less about rebellion and more about alignment. About living a life that matches your actual values, not the ones you were conditioned into. That's not arrogance. That's maturity. One of the most difficult parts of leaving religion, and also one of the most liberating, is realizing that there's no script anymore. There's no built-in narrative where everything happens for a divine reason. No higher being watching your every move. No eternal scoreboard deciding if you pass or fail. At first, that can feel disorienting. Like someone just wiped the rules off the chalkboard and said, "Go live." But eventually, that becomes the beauty of it, because you're no longer living for an afterlife you can't see, prove, or experience. You're living for this one. The only one you know you have. That shift changes everything. You don't have to wait for divine permission. And in that realism, there's room for empathy, for action, for change. You stop seeing tragedy as punishment or test. You stop writing off injustice as part of God's plan. You stop waiting for divine intervention and start understanding that if anything's going to improve, it has to be us. Here, now. That's a heavy responsibility. But it's also empowering, because once you realize there's no cosmic referee, you stop outsourcing your ethics. You become accountable to people, not to dogma. You weigh decisions based on consequences, not commandments. You choose values that hold up in the real world, not ones that only make sense under supernatural logic. This is one of the most under-discussed parts of life after religion, the depth of meaning that comes not from being told why you're here, but from deciding for yourself. People often assume that without a God, life becomes meaningless. But the opposite is true. When you're no longer living for a reward, your actions matter more, not less. When you know your time is limited, every moment becomes more valuable, not less. When you realize no one's coming to fix things, you stop waiting and start acting. That's not nihilism. It's clarity. And with that clarity comes peace, not the kind promised by sacred texts, but the kind that grows when you no longer need to force reality to fit a story. When you accept what's uncertain and make peace with what's unknowable. And still, even with all that freedom, people hesitate to walk away, not because they believe, but because they're afraid of what it means if they don't. Afraid of what they'll lose. Afraid of being alone. And that fear is real. But what they often discover is that outside religion, they're not alone. They're not the only ones who've doubted. Not the only ones who've outgrown the system. Not the only ones who stopped finding answers and started searching for truth instead. More people are on that path than you might think. Quietly, carefully, thoughtfully, because this isn't about rage. It's not about rejection for its own sake. It's about coming to the point where staying silent costs more than speaking up. Where pretending to believe becomes harder than admitting you don't. And if that moment comes, and it does for many, the hardest part isn't leaving. It's realizing you were never as trapped as you thought. The walls were made of words. The chains were mental. The gate was open. You were told that walking away was dangerous. That truth lives only inside the circle. That leaving would mean losing your way. But what you find again and again is that leaving isn't the end of the road. It's the start of one. And that what felt like escape might have been arrival, to be happy, or to love who you love, or to pursue knowledge, pleasure, curiosity, or growth. You don't have to pretend that pain makes sense when it doesn't. You can just call it what it is, part of life. Unfair, sometimes meaningless, but real.